On March 1st, 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant signed into law a bill which created Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone National Park was the first park anywhere in the world, and no one knew exactly how they should be run. So no laws were passed what could go on in a national park, and no money was appropriated as to what could go on in the park. So from 1872 to 1889, civilians, volunteer civilians, were in charge of the park. There was a lot of corruption going on in later years of the park, so it was decided in 1889 that the Army would take over the administration of Yellowstone National Park. The Army moved in and built a small fort. They called it a camp, Camp Sheridan, up on top of a hill just at the base of the Mammoth Terraces. After being there a number of years, they realized that they were going to be there quite a while, so they decided to build Fort Yellowstone. Fort Yellowstone, they started out with the buildings out of wood, of course, and the wood provided by the park. The park itself was where the lumber was cut to build the homes. They built two officer buildings, which were each one was a duplex. So they ended up with 8 officers' quarters. Now they weren't high-ranking officers; they were low-ranking officers. Later on, of course, they decided that have a real fort that would be visited by the public, so they decided to build with stone. They indeed called this Fort Yellowstone. If you want to visit Yellowstone, you can stop in at any visitor center and get a map of Fort Yellowstone and then take a self-walking tour of the park. You'll start out at the Bachelor Officers' Quarters, better known as Bedlam in many cases. Today it's a museum. People could gather there and watch the Army practice the various armed maneuvers out on the parade ground of the park. They built this of stone. Today it's a museum. You can visit it, and they're glad that you're there. Across the street from the museum is a building built by Captain Chittenden. He was with the United States Corps of Engineers. The uniqueness of this building is that the walls slant inward as they go up, giving it a pagoda-type appearance. Then, of course, you had to build quarters for the officers in Yellowstone. So the first quarters built for the officers was a double building. High-ranking officers lived there. And then they built a building for the superintendent. The superintendent was usually a general or a high-ranking officer in the United States Army. Along the line of Fort Yellowstone, they built officers' quarters. They were divided in two. The interesting thing about these particular buildings is when they were built, they cost $3,000 each, which the Army thought was an outrageous price for such a building. Then, of course, every fort must have a guardhouse. Yellowstone's guardhouse was really not very big because they had other ways of disciplining men who misbehaved in the Army, but they did have a guardhouse that they could use. The last building, interestingly enough, to be built in Fort Yellowstone was the chapel. After everything else was built, they decided they needed a building for religious purposes. There was a minister by the name of Whiskey Jack, and the Army would not pay for building a chapel, so Whiskey Jack managed to raise most of the money to build the fort or build the church from the bars down in Gardner. And he got enough money to build a pretty nice church. Every fort must have barracks. The enlisted men in Yellowstone lived in buildings similar to this, which was a barrack. It was just one great big room inside, and that was where the enlisted men stayed. Of course, every cavalry group must have a stable. So Yellowstone stables were made of stone. The interesting part of this is you'll notice the number of windows along the wall there. That was 2 horses per window, and there's windows on the other side as well. So a cavalry unit had lots of horses. In order to live in an isolated area like Mammoth Hot Springs in Yellowstone Park, you must have some type of a entertainment facility. So this is a canteen. The canteen has a basketball type court inside of it. It had a library. It had all the necessary things that the soldiers would use for entertainment. The largest building of Fort Yellowstone is a double barracks. These barracks were built by stonemasons that were imported from Scotland. They were Scottish stonemasons. The stone was quarried just a little to the north of Fort Yellowstone, between Fort Yellowstone and Gardner, Montana. It's a sandstone type stone. The Scottish stonemasons knew exactly how to cut the stone so that eventually they'd all fit together and form a beautiful building. You'll notice that across the top of the windows there is some stone, and this stone too was quarried at that local quarry. With as many horses as they had in Yellowstone, one of the things you needed, of course, was a blacksmith shop. The blacksmith was a civilian, not a soldier, but he would shoe the horses twice a year. He'd put summer shoes on them, and then in the late fall, he'd put winter shoes. And the winter shoes, of course, had spike-like things that went down into the horseshoes so that the horse could walk on packed snow and less likely to slip or fall. I was privileged enough to give several tours of Fort Yellowstone over the years, and as you can see here, I was a pretty skinny guy back in those days. In 1916, the Army decided one of the things they wanted to do was fight World War I. So the use of the Army in Yellowstone was coming to end. It also was time for a new organization to be organized within the federal government, and thus the beginning of the National Park Service. In 1916, the United States Army, who had been in Yellowstone for a period of 30 years, turned over control of the park to the National Park Service. Today, you can visit Yellowstone, you can see Fort Yellowstone, and a good time to do such a thing is in the early spring or late fall, because the visitation is a little lower at that time, and you get to see more of the animals that Yellowstone is so famous for. So I hope you enjoy your trip in Yellowstone, and remember to stop and see Fort Yellowstone at Mammoth Hot Springs.